afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on a tradition unlike any other. Nope, it's not the Masters, it's the Olympics. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to be looking at the origins of the Olympic Games. Now, what's particularly cool about this is that there isn't just one origin story here. Nope, we've got at least 5 different quote-unquote origin stories for the Olympic Games. Some in the modern world, and at least 3 different ones in the ancient world. Our stories are going to take us into the 19th century struggles between empires and nation states, into the early modern world of jolly old England, to the poor Greek hero who was chopped up by his dad and served for dinner. And of course, to good old Heracles, greatest of the Greek heroes. So when do the games truly begin? Well, that's going to be up for you to decide. So whether you're looking to rekindle an old flame or to start something completely new, journey with me as we investigate the origin of the Olympic Games. The Olympics. The worldwide sporting event that brings together athletes and nations from all over the world to compete for shining glory on behalf of their beloved country. Now, without a doubt, when you hear the term ancient athletics, the Olympics is one of, if not the first thing that comes to mind. And the history of the Olympics goes all the way back to the birth of archaic Greece, way back to the dawn of the 8th century BCE, almost 3,000 years ago. But we're going to start today with the modern Olympic Games, which really only started back up in 1896 after taking about a 1,500-year break in the action. So let's go ahead and dive into the world of 19th century Europe and see how the flame of the Olympics was once again rekindled. It was the 1890s, and this old mustachioed chap right here, a Frenchman by the name of Pierre de Coubertin, had an idea. An idea to bring together nations from around the world to compete in a series of athletic events, in much the same way that the ancient Greek city-states competed with each other millennia ago. And in 1890, he founded the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, which still exists today. And it was decided that the very first modern Olympic Games would be held in Athens in that year of 1896. Now, Athens itself had just revitalized the Pan-Athenaic Stadium, the central location for the new Olympic Games. It stands on the ground of the ancient Pan-Athenaic Stadium, which ironically never housed the Olympics at all, but rather the ancient Athenian civic games that honored Athena as part of the Pan-Athenaic festival. Now the stadium could hold tens of thousands of people, and it remains, to this day, the only stadium in the whole world that's entirely made out of marble. Oh, and look at this. We've got some awesome ancient footage here of your professor standing majestically atop the podium in the Pan-Athenaic Stadium as the true champion that he actually is. Now, if you're interested in joining the champ atop the podium, probably as 2nd or 3rd place, let's be honest here, because you know I'd have 1st place on lockdown. I'll have to keep you posted about our Arizona and the Aegean Study Abroad program. It's absolutely incredible. It is the trip of a lifetime. Anyway, this isn't a commercial for study abroad. Anyway, let's get back to the action here. Back to the Olympics. The first Olympics held in the Pan-Athenaic Stadium in Athens in 1896. Pierre de Coubertin's creation brought together 241 athletes from 14 different nations, and they competed in 43 different events. Now, that might not seem like a lot of events, but consider the fact that the very first Olympics, in ancient Greece, had one measly event, a 200-meter sprint. And that was it. And that's a good way of highlighting that these modern Olympics were certainly inspired by the famous ancient Greek athletic event, but in no way was it an exact replica. Now, when you read about the history of the modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin and the 1896 Games in Athens always take the stage front and center. But what's less well known is that de Coubertin's creation was just the most recent, and to give him credit, the most impactful and successful, of a series of Olympic rebirths that stretch back more than 400 years and span the width of the European continent. De Coubertin's games weren't even the first modern Olympic Games in Greece. Earlier in the 19th century, Evangelos Zappos, a Greek philanthropist, decided to restart the Olympic Games as a contest between the newly independent Greeks and the Ottoman Empire, their former ruling power. Zappos was the one who founded the restoration and funded the restoration of the Panathenaic Stadium, which was the whole reason de Coubertin's games could take place there in 1896. So he should definitely get more credit. Anyway, Zappa's games started in 1859 and they ran through the 1870s. But Zappa's idea didn't come out of nowhere either. The Brits had been thinking of a new set of Olympic Games right at the same time. And in the 1860s, the National Olympian Association was founded. And in 1862, the Grand Olympic Festival was held in Liverpool in the 1860s. Anyway, the National Olympian Association provided the framework that was later adopted by the IOC. But it wasn't even the first Olympic Games in Britain either. Rather, in Britain, William Brooks, a decade earlier, had started the Olympic CLAS in 1850, which later evolved into the Wenlock Olympic Games, which kind of amazingly still take place today. I have to imagine not too many people are angling to get into the Wenlock Olympic Games, and they probably prefer the actual Olympic Games. Anyway, the Wenlock Games still exist. Now, the French, of course, would not be happy at all if I gave the British all the credit here. So in all due fairness, the French actually had a national Olympic festival, l'Olympiade de la République, going on all the way back in 1796 and 1798, just after the Revolution. Nothing like tacking on a new set of Olympic Games to start your newfound revolution. But in a stunning come-from-behind victory, the Brits do take first place in terms of the first modern Olympic Games. The earliest agreed-upon restart of the Olympic Games comes from the Cotswold Olympic Games in England in the early part of the 1600s. They were started by a lawyer, a guy by the name of Robert Dover, in 1612, and they were approved by King James I, King James of biblical translation fame. Yep, we are talking Shakespearean times here. Now, the Cotswold Games include some of the Greek classics, right, like running and jumping, and some medieval English specialties, things like coursing with hounds, and fighting with cudgels, and the always famous sledgehammer throwing. Anyway, the Cotswold Olympic Games, they lasted for quite a while. They were only shut down in 1852 after more than 200 years of competing. But they've been recently revived, and they include such awesome events as dwile flonking and shin kicking, the always popular tug of war, the inimitable piano smashing, and of course, the very famous Morris dancing. I have no idea what most of those things are, but I've got to go see those games myself. Alright, so our story of the modern Olympics gets us all the way back to the early 1600s in Britain. But that means there's still a 1300-year gap between the start of the modern games and the end of the ancient games. And that gap's a lot bigger if you're going all the way back to the start of the ancient games. Now, the ancient Greeks had at least two different origin myths that explained how the very first Olympic Games came to be. And there are actually more than that branch off in slightly different directions. Anyway, the first of these goes back to the chariot race I mentioned earlier, the one that's depicted on the pedimental sculpture on the Temple of Zeus. Now, the story's kind of weird, and it begins with our hero, a guy by the name of Pelops. Now this story will have a happy ending for Pelops, but the guy's early life, it was straight up awful. He was the son of a guy named Tantalus, a mythological villain known for his transgressions against the gods. And when Pelops was a kid, his dad Tantalus chopped him up into little bitty pieces, baked him inside of a pie, and tried to feed him to the gods, all in order to test the omniscience of the gods by seeing if they could tell that a human was baked into their food. The gods, of course, could tell, all except Demeter, that is. She actually accidentally ate part of Pelops' shoulder because she was still so sad about Persephone. But anyway, that's kind of a story for the classical mythology class. Anyway, Tantalus was punished in a horrific, or shall I say, tantalizing manner. Yep, that's where we get the word tantalizing. And you'll have to check out that mythology course if you want to find out what happens to Tantalus. It's a hoot, though. Anyway, the gods felt bad for poor old Pelops, and they put him back together. And Hephaestus, right, god of the forge, even made him a new shoulder to replace the one that Demeter ate. After growing up in Phrygia, a place in modern-day Turkey, Pelops traveled all the way to western Greece and the Peloponnese. Hopefully that name's sounding a little familiar now, right? Pelops, Peloponnese, maybe a connection there. Anyway, there he fell in love with the beautiful princess Hippodamia. Such a sweet love story. Now, there was only one problem. Hippodamia was the daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa. Not the Pisa in Italy, that's a different one, the one with the Leaning Tower. This Pisa's in western Peloponnese in Greece. And King Oenomaus had received a prophecy that his son-in-law would kill him. So to prevent Hippodamia from ever getting married, he made a deal. To marry his daughter, you had to beat him in a chariot race. And if you lost, he was going to cut off your head and put it on the wall. And well, Oenomaus was simply unbeatable in chariot racing, since he was riding with horses given to him by the god of war Ares. And in this way, Oenomaus had defeated and killed 18 different suitors who sought Hippodamia's hand in marriage by the time that Pelops showed up. Now, when Pelops heard about this, he prayed to the god Poseidon, right, god of the sea. And then together with Hippodamia, they went to the charioteer of Oenomaus, a guy by the name of Myrtilus, and they made a deal with him. They promised him half the kingdom and the first night in bed with Hippodamia if he'd sabotage Oenomaus' chariot. So Myrtilus replaced the linchpins in the axle, and instead of wood or metal, he used wax the night before the race was to begin. Now, the race started the next day, and Pelops sped ahead for an early lead, but then Oenomaus started to gain on him. And just when he was about to catch Pelops, those linchpins, the wax linchpins, began to melt because of the heat generated by the wheels. And once melted, the wheels flew off the chariot, and Oenomaus plummeted to the ground, and there he was dragged to death by his horses. Myrtilus, Oenomaus' charioteer, survived, at least for a while. But when he came to claim his night with Hippodamia, right? Remember he was promised that first night. Pelops reneged on the agreement, and he threw him off a cliff to plummet to his death. Pelops, not very nice there. Not very nice at all. Anyway, it turns out that this would curse the house of Atreus for generations to come. But Pelops didn't know that at the time. Instead, Pelops took Hippodamia as his wife, and he went on to found the very first Olympic Games in order to cleanse himself of the treachery involved in the famous chariot race. Legend had it, in ancient Greece, that one of the tourney posts from that very first race still existed in later times, a testament to Pelops' founding of the Olympic Games. Alright, so let's take a second for that gruesome saga to soak in before we move on to our next founding myth. Okay, there we go. Anyway, this one involves the greatest hero in all of Greek mythology. That's right, our main man, Heracles. You might know him from his Latin name, Hercules. Anyway, you've probably at least heard of this dude and the fact that he had to complete 12 nearly impossible labors in order to cleanse himself from the sin of killing his wife and children. Now, we don't need to go into all 12 of those labors, but one was extra shitty. Very, very literally. So as his fifth labor, he had to clean the stables of King Algeus. But these just weren't any stables. Algeus had more cattle than anyone in all of Greece. And the cattle themselves were semi-divine, so they produced massive amounts of crap. Oh, and he wasn't big on cleaning. The stables had never ever been cleaned. So rather than shoveling, Heracles dug an irrigation trench, and he diverted the water of the nearby river Alpheus. And the water then ran through the stables, carrying all the crap out the other side with it. Now, after completing all 12 of his labors, Heracles returned to the river Alpheus, which had helped him out in this labor. And there he founded the Olympic Games in order to honor his father Zeus, who had protected him throughout his labors. Heracles brought with him the olive tree, which he planted in the sacred precinct at Olympia. And then he marched off 200 steps, back to back to back to back, 200 times in a row. You get it. And that became the distance of the Stadion, a 200-meter sprint race that was the very first event ever at the Olympic Games, which of course are named after Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in mainland Greece, where his dad, that good old guy Zeus, maybe not such a good guy, but that king of the gods Zeus, lived and ruled. The winner, of course, got a crown made from the branch of the olive tree that Heracles brought to the Altus at Olympia. So the myths that the ancient Greeks told about the origin of the Olympic Games are undeniably awesome, right? They're great stories. But I think we can assume that Pelops didn't actually kill Oenomaus, and Heracles probably didn't actually divert the waters of the river Alpheus. So then the question is, how did the real Olympic Games actually begin? Well, no one really knows when the first Olympics actually was, but we can put together a rough guess. And that's because we have these awesome things. That's right, ancient Olympic victor lists preserved on papyri tell us who won each of the games. So we've got ancient textual evidence that puts in order all the winners of the Olympic Games since they first began. And since we know that these happened every 4 years, we can then count backwards to get to the very first starting date of the very first Olympics. And when we do that, we frequently get 776 BCE. So why can't we be certain? Why isn't 776 BCE set in stone? Well, one of the problems is that there's more than one of these victor lists, and they all lead to different dates. In addition, later historians start dating things based on the number of Olympiads, and then they count the number of Olympiads that an event occurred in. So we'll see that the 30 Years' Peace between Athens and Sparta, a major event in the Peloponnesian War, that was agreed to in the third year of the 83rd Olympiad, right? So you do 83 times 4, and then you add 3 onto that, and then you can get the date of that. And if we start tracing those backwards, we then get different dates as well, right? So it puts us in the same range, right around 800 BC, but sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later. So while no one knows for sure exactly which year contained the very first Olympics, we tend to go with 776 BC, and we can feel decently certain that it was sometime around the start of the 8th century BC. Now, in the modern world, there are currently 441 events spread across the Summer and Winter Olympics. But in the very first Olympic Games, guess what? There was only one. Maybe I should have 2 fingers. There was only one event. And it was called the Stadion, a sprint foot race. And the Stadion was both the name of the race and the name of the distance, about 200 meters using modern measurements. Remember, according to the ancient Greeks, this was marked out by Heracles walking back to back to back 200 of his feet across this area. And guess where the event took place? Where did that event take place? That's right, in the Stadion. So the distance was the Stadion, the race was the Stadion, the stadium's the Stadion, and that's where we get our term stadium as well in the modern world. But it originally comes from the designation of being the place that contained the Stadion race. So keep that next time you're at the stadium. Now the winner of the very first Olympics was a guy by the name of Coroebus from the nearby town of Elis. And by day, Coroebus was just a cook and a baker. But with his victory in the Stadion, at the very first Olympics, he solidified his name in Olympic lore for millennia to come. So we saw a preview of past meets present, with the Olympic Games evolving from one single event in 776 BC to more than 400 events in 2018. But what else has changed? And for that matter, what's remained the same? Let's start with what remains the same. I think the basic idea that we've got here is still pretty similar. It's still called the Olympic Games. They still bring together athletes from politically disparate regions to compete athletically. Moreover, the Olympic oath of fair play and the commitment to peaceful assembly is something that happened in the ancient world just like it still does today. Now, the games and events themselves have certainly evolved, but some of them are still really reminiscent of what would have existed in antiquity. So things like foot races, things like boxing, wrestling, the pentathlon, all those existed in ancient Greece. All those still exist today. But there are a number of differences, and in fact, the number of differences is probably greater. So first of all, the games now travel the world. So rather than just being held in a rural sanctuary at Olympia every 4 years, they now go from site to site to site. The idea of medals as prizes, right? Gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal. Those would have been totally foreign to the ancient Greeks, who gave out wreaths, botanical wreaths, to the victors of the Olympic Games. In particular, was the olive wreath from that tree that Heracles brought to the site. And speaking of victors, there was no second place. There was no third place in antiquity. You either won or you lost. That was it. Also of vital importance, well, we wear clothes today when we compete, right? Rather than doing it entirely in the nude. It would have been a much different picture if you were watching the games in antiquity. Now, much of the iconography, things like the Olympic rings, those are also completely modern. And the torch relay, that's also a new creation, never happened at the ancient Olympic Games. And perhaps most fundamentally, right, women weren't allowed to compete in the ancient games, which would have made it a completely different environment. Now, the events themselves have changed dramatically as well. So in antiquity, there were no ball sports at the Olympics. There were no aquatic sports at the Olympics. There were no team sports at the Olympics. There were no winter sports at the Olympics. There were no women's sports at the Olympics. There were no weight classes at the Olympics. The Olympics was a pretty different place, and those types of events and the people who participated in those events have really evolved over time. So in short, the idea of the modern Olympic Games does have some real similarities with the ancient Olympic Games held in Greece. But the specifics of those games have evolved quite a bit over the past few thousand years. All right, you have made it through another lecture. Very well done. Now, along the way today, we have seen the evolution of the Olympic Games, both in the modern world and in the ancient world. And we've seen that the concept of the start or the origin of the Olympic Games is pretty complicated. You could go with Pierre de Coubertin in 1896, or it could be the Cotswolds Games in Shakespearean times. It could be Pelops after defeating Oenomaus, or it could be Heracles in the aftermath of his 12 labors. It could be Coroebus of Elis winning that very first stadion, which could have happened in 776 BC, or perhaps a little earlier, or perhaps a little later. Either way, we've seen the games change and evolve over time. And they've changed and grown in antiquity, and they continue to change and grow in the modern world as well. So don't worry about hanging on to some mythical past. Take what you like and adapt it for the future. Just a couple lessons you can learn from the origin of the Olympic Games.